you're in my seat," the platinum blonde woman said, her voice dripping with the kind of entitlement that money can't buy, but privilege certainly can. She was staring down at the man in the black hoodie who had the audacity to occupy what she considered her personal throne at 35,000 feet. What she didn't know was that she had just declared war on the wrong person. The man she was about to humiliate owned more than just the seat. He owned the entire airline, and in the next hour her world was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. But to understand how we got to this moment of pure, unfiltered karma, we need to rewind 12 hours to a penthouse in Detroit, where one of the most powerful men in America was about to make a decision that would change everything. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Malik Washington's penthouse should have felt like victory. At 35, he had just closed the deal of his lifetime, a hostile takeover that would send shockwaves through Wall Street before the markets even opened. Nexus Dynamics. The tech empire he had built from his college dorm room had just acquired Skyline Airlines for a staggering $12 billion. The paperwork was still warm from the digital signatures, and his legal team was working around the clock to finalize every detail. But instead of celebrating, Malik stood in his kitchen making coffee with hands that moved on autopilot while his mind raced through the implications of what he had just accomplished. The penthouse around him told the story of a man who had never forgotten where he came from. Yes, there was original artwork on the walls and furniture that cost more than most people's cars, but there were also family photos covering every available surface. His parents at their small restaurant in Detroit's Corktown, his grandmother's hands teaching him to code on an ancient computer. His father's construction company, the business that had put food on the table until the day Malik could return the favor. The acquisition wasn't just business, it was personal. Skyline Airlines had a reputation, one that Malik intended to change from the inside out. For too long, the airline industry had operated like an old boys' club where discrimination was disguised as policy and bias masqueraded as procedure. Malik had experienced it firsthand during his early days as an entrepreneur, being told he didn't belong in first class, even when he had paid full price, being questioned about his ability to afford business class tickets, being treated like a problem to solve rather than a customer to serve. His phone buzzed with another call from his acquisition team, the third one in the past hour. He let it go to voicemail, knowing it was probably James Mitchell Skyline's VP of Operations trying to coordinate the transition. There would be time for corporate politics later. Right now, Malik needed to think. The irony wasn't lost on him that in a few hours he would be flying commercial to London for a series of meetings about Nexus Dynamics' European expansion. He could have taken his private jet, could have avoided the hassles of commercial aviation entirely. But Malik made it a point to experience the world the way most people did. How could he improve an airline if he never actually flew on it? He grabbed his worn leather duffel bag, the same one he had carried through college, and packed light. Designer jeans that looked ordinary, a cashmere hoodie with no visible logos, sneakers that cost a fortune but looked like something from any mall store. To most people, he would look like any other traveler. That was exactly the point. As he headed for the door, his reflection in the hallway mirror showed a man who carried the weight of success with quiet confidence. There were no flashy accessories, no entourage, no signs of the billions that his signature was worth. Just a black man in comfortable clothes ready to board a plane and sit in the seat he had rightfully purchased. If only he had known that the seat he was about to occupy would become the epicenter of a confrontation that would go viral around the world and change an entire industry forever. 300 miles away, in her glass-walled corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, Victoria Ashford was having the kind of morning that would have broken a weaker person. At 42, she had built her career on her father's connections and her own ruthless ambition. But both were failing her now in spectacular fashion. The platinum blonde hair that she maintained at a cost most people would consider obscene was pulled back in a severe bun that matched her mood. Her manicured nails drummed against the mahogany desk as she stared at the numbers on her computer screen, each one representing another nail in the coffin of her professional life. Platinum Capital, the hedge fund where she served as vice president, was hemorrhaging clients faster than she could count. 3 major pension funds had pulled their investments in the past month alone, citing concerns about the fund's cultural fit and values alignment. Translation, someone had finally started paying attention to the complaints that had been filed against Victoria over the years. Her assistant knocked tentatively on the door, knowing better than to enter without permission when Victoria was in one of her moods. "Miss Ashford, your car to O'Hare is here." Victoria didn't look up from her screen. "Cancel it. I'm not going anywhere until someone explains to me how we lost the teacher's retirement account. Ma'am, you have the London meeting with the European investors. If you miss this flight, if I miss this meeting, we're done anyway." Victoria finally raised her eyes, and her assistant took an involuntary step backward. "Those investors are our last chance. Without their money, Platinum Capital folds, and I spend the rest of my career explaining why Daddy's little girl couldn't keep his legacy alive." The truth was harsher than Victoria would admit to anyone, even herself. Her father had built Platinum Capital from nothing, turning a small investment firm into a powerhouse that managed billions in assets. But he had also built it in an era when discrimination was easier to hide, when complaints could be buried under legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Victoria had inherited his business acumen, but she had also inherited his prejudices. The difference was that the world had changed around her while she remained stubbornly, dangerously the same. She stood and smoothed her designer suit, the kind that cost more than most people earned in a month. The London meeting was her Hail Mary, her last chance to convince European investors that Platinum Capital was worth saving. But first, she had to survive 8 hours in a metal tube surrounded by people she considered beneath her. The ride to O'Hare was a master class in casual cruelty. Victoria berated her driver for taking a route that was 30 seconds slower than her preferred path. She snapped at the skycap, who offered to help with her luggage, insisting that she could handle her own Hermes bags. She cut in front of a family with young children at the check-in counter, claiming that her status as a frequent flyer gave her priority. At the first-class check-in desk, she was greeted by name by the agent, a testament to how often she made this particular journey. "Miss Ashford, wonderful to see you again. Seat 1A is ready for you just as you prefer. Seat 1A. It had become more than just a preference for Victoria. It was a superstition, a ritual, a security blanket made of leather and privilege. For 4 years she had flown the Chicago to London route every quarter, and for 4 years she had occupied the same seat. In her mind it was hers by right of repetition, by virtue of the thousands of dollars she spent on tickets, by the simple fact that she was Victoria Ashford, and she deserved the best of everything. She made her way to the first-class lounge, where she proceeded to establish her dominance over the space like a territorial predator. She criticized the temperature of her coffee, demanded a table with a better view, and spoke loudly on her phone about confidential business matters, making sure everyone around her knew exactly how important she was. "I don't care if the compliance department has concerns," she barked into her phone, oblivious to the stares from other passengers. "Those documents need to be in London before the markets open Monday. I've been transporting sensitive materials on this route for years without incident. One more trip won't kill anyone." What Victoria didn't realize was that her habit of carrying questionable financial documents across international borders was about to intersect with a new reality in ways that would destroy everything she had worked to build. As boarding time approached, she gathered her belongings and prepared for what she expected to be another routine flight. Another 8 hours in her rightful seat. Another successful delivery of materials that existed in the gray areas of financial law, another step toward saving her failing firm. She had no idea that the man who was about to challenge her perceived ownership of Seat 1A was not just any passenger. He was the new owner of every seat on the plane, including hers, and her decision to treat him like an obstacle to be removed was about to trigger a chain reaction that would end with her in federal custody and her entire world in ruins. Chicago O'Hare Airport at 8 in the morning was a symphony of controlled chaos, and Malik Washington moved through it like a man who understood that true power was often invisible. While other business travelers hurried past with their phones pressed to their ears and their stress worn like expensive cologne, Malik walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned the ground beneath his feet. He had learned long ago that the key to navigating the world as a black billionaire was to make yourself unremarkable until the moment you chose to be seen. The designer clothes with no logos, the expensive luggage that looked ordinary, the way he helped an elderly woman with her carry-on bag while other first-class passengers walked past. All of it was calculated to fly under the radar of people's assumptions. At the first-class check-in counter, the agent barely looked up from her screen as she processed his ticket. "Mr. Washington, you're confirmed in seat 1A. We'll begin boarding in about 30 minutes. Behind him in line, Victoria Ashford was finishing a phone call that had grown increasingly heated as she discussed what sounded like sensitive financial arrangements. Malik couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation, his business instincts picking up on terms that suggested questionable trading practices and document transfers that existed in legal gray areas. "I said handle it." Victoria snapped into her phone loud enough that half the terminal could hear. "I don't pay you to question my methods. Just make sure everything is ready on the London end." When she approached the counter, her entire demeanor changed. Gone was the sharp-edged aggression she had displayed on the phone. In its place was the practiced charm that wealthy people deployed when they needed something. "Victoria Ashford," she announced to the agent as if her name should trigger some kind of celebrity recognition protocol. "I assume seat 1A is ready for me as usual?" The agent checked her screen and frowned slightly. "Ms. Ashford, I show that seat is already assigned to another passenger. But I have you confirmed in seat 2C, which is also a window seat in first class." Victoria's smile disappeared so quickly it was like watching a mask fall off. "There must be some mistake. I've sat in 1A on this route for 4 years. Check your system again." "I've checked twice, ma'am. The seat is properly assigned to Mr. Washington, who checked in first. But 2C is an excellent seat, and I don't want 2C. Victoria's voice had taken on the edge of someone who was used to getting her way through sheer force of will. "I need 1A. Call your supervisor." Malik continued toward the gate, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed the first act of what was going to be a much longer drama. He had seen that look before, the expression of someone who viewed the world as a series of obstacles that existed solely to be overcome or removed. In the first-class lounge, Victoria had cornered the gate agent and was holding court about the unacceptable service she was receiving. Her voice carried across the space like fingernails on a chalkboard, demanding that someone explain to her why her preferences weren't being accommodated. "I spend more money with this airline than any other passenger on this route," she was saying, her finger jabbing at the air for emphasis. "I think that earns me the courtesy of my usual seat assignment." The gate agent, a professional woman named Sarah Martinez, who had clearly dealt with difficult passengers before maintained her composure with admirable skill. "Ms. Ashford, I understand your frustration, but seat assignments are based on when reservations are made and confirmed. The passenger in 1A made his reservation and selected his seat before you did." "Then move him," Victoria said, as if the solution was obvious. "Put him in economy. Give him an upgrade voucher for his next flight. I'm sure he'll be grateful for the gesture." It was the casual assumption in her voice that chilled Malik to the bone. Not just that he could be moved, but that he would be grateful for the privilege of being displaced, that he should be thankful for whatever scraps of consideration were thrown his way. Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am, I can't move a passenger who has paid for and is properly assigned to a first-class seat." "Mister," Washington has every right to occupy the seat he purchased. Mr. Washington. Victoria repeated the name like she was tasting something bitter. Her eyes scanned the lounge until they found Malik sitting quietly in a corner with his tablet and a cup of coffee. The assessment she made was swift and dismissive, taking in his casual clothes and unassuming presence and reaching exactly the conclusion that Malik had expected. Him, she said loud enough that several other passengers turned to look. "You're telling me that my seat is being given to someone who probably used frequent flyer miles to upgrade from coach." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the lounge was suddenly acutely aware that they had just witnessed something crossing the line from customer service dispute to something much uglier and more personal. Malik slowly closed his tablet and stood up. He walked over to where Victoria was standing, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that people had to strain to hear him, which somehow made his words carry more weight than if he had shouted. "Excuse me," he said, looking directly at Victoria. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about my seat assignment. I want to make sure I understand your concern correctly." Victoria turned to face him, and for a moment something flickered in her expression that might have been recognition that she had crossed a line. But it was quickly replaced by the doubled-down defiance of someone who had committed too fully to a position to back down gracefully. "I've been flying this route for years," she said, her chin lifted in challenge. "Seat 1. A is where I always sit. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." "I'm sure we can too," Malik replied, his tone so reasonable that it was almost conversational. "I paid full price for a first-class ticket just like you did. I selected my seat when I made my reservation just like you did. So I'm curious about what kind of arrangement you think would benefit everyone when you're asking me to give up something I've already paid for." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Victoria realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as she had expected. The man standing in front of her wasn't backing down or showing the deference she was used to receiving. Instead, he was forcing her to articulate exactly what she was asking for and why she thought she deserved it. "Look," she said, trying a different approach. "I have a very important meeting in London, the kind that determines whether companies succeed or fail. I need to be able to rest properly during this flight, and 1A is the only seat where I can do that effectively." "That sounds like a challenge," Malik said sympathetically. "I have important meetings in London too. In fact, I have several meetings that will determine whether companies succeed or fail. But I'm confident that Seat 2C will allow both of us to arrive well-rested and ready for our respective challenges." It was a masterful deflection, acknowledging her concern, while refusing to accept the premise that her needs were more important than his. And the reference to his own business importance was delivered so smoothly that it almost sounded like an afterthought. Victoria's face flushed red as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. The charm had failed, the demands had been deflected, and she was running out of options, which meant it was time to escalate to the nuclear option, the one that had never failed her before. She turned back to Sarah Martinez with the expression of someone playing their final card. "I want to speak to the captain. There's clearly been some kind of error in your reservation system, and I think the flight crew needs to understand the situation before we board." Sarah glanced at Malik, who simply nodded with what looked like resigned acceptance. "Of course, Ms. Ashford. I'll contact the cockpit and have Captain Stone come speak with you." As Sarah reached for her radio, Malik pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. "Legal team. Need confirmation that all Skyline acquisition paperwork filed. Timeline critical." The response came back almost immediately. "Filed 90 minutes ago. You now officially own every bolt on every plane." Malik smiled and put his phone back in his pocket. This was about to get very interesting. The announcement for Flight 847 to London came across the gate area speakers with the routine professionalism that masked the drama building behind the scenes. "We'd like to welcome our first-class passengers for priority boarding. Malik gathered his modest carry-on bag and moved toward the boarding line with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. Around him, other passengers jockeyed for position with the desperate urgency of people who believed that boarding 30 seconds earlier would somehow improve their 8-hour flight experience. Victoria pushed past several passengers to reach the front of the line, her designer luggage rolling behind her like a declaration of war. She had spent the past 20 minutes in increasingly heated conversation with various airline employees, each conversation escalating her sense of righteous indignation. "I want to be very clear about something," she announced to the gate agent checking boarding passes. "There's been a serious error with the seat assignments. I'll be speaking to the captain once we're on board to resolve this situation." The agent, who had clearly been briefed about the developing situation, simply nodded and scanned Victoria's boarding pass. "Of course, Ms. Ashford. I'm sure everything will work out." Malik followed Victoria down the jet bridge, noting how she moved with the aggressive stride of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around her convenience. He had seen this behavior before in boardrooms and business negotiations, the territorial display that powerful people use to establish dominance before a confrontation. The aircraft was a Boeing 777, spacious and modern, with the kind of first-class cabin that justified the premium price tag. Seat 1A was positioned perfectly for privacy and legroom, the kind of seat that frequent travelers fought over and airline loyalty programs used as currency for customer retention. Malik found his seat and settled in, quietly pulling out his tablet to review some documents for his London meetings. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was reading acquisition reports for the very airline he was currently flying, but he kept his expression neutral as other passengers filed past him. Victoria appeared in the aisle next to Seat 1A like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She stopped and stared down at Malik with the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe that her problem hadn't solved itself in the intervening minutes. "You're still here," she said, as if his presence was some kind of personal affront to the natural order of the universe. "This is my seat," Malik replied without looking up from his tablet. "So, yes, I'm still here." "We need to talk," Victoria said, setting her bag down in the aisle and effectively blocking other passengers from reaching their seats. "I've spoken to the gate agents and they agree that there's been some kind of system error. You're going to need to move." Malik slowly looked up and met her eyes. "No, I'm not." The simplicity of his response seemed to catch Victoria off guard. She had expected negotiation or argument, or at least some acknowledgement of the complicated situation she was describing. Instead, she got 2 words delivered with the finality of a door closing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising loud enough that other passengers began to take notice. "I said, no, I'm not moving. I paid for this seat. I reserved this seat. I'm going to sit in this seat for the duration of this flight. If you have a problem with that arrangement, I suggest you take it up with the airline's customer service department." A flight attendant appeared at Victoria's elbow, a blonde woman in her 40s whose name tag read Blair Whitfield. Blair had the kind of polished professionalism that came from years of dealing with difficult passengers, but there was something in her expression that suggested she had already chosen sides in this confrontation. "Miss Ashford," Blair said with warm familiarity, "I understand there's been some confusion about seat assignments. Let me see what I can do to help resolve this situation." Victoria smiled for the first time since boarding, recognizing an ally when she saw one. "Blair, thank God. You know how important this route is for me. I can't have my preparation disrupted by sitting in an unfamiliar seat." Blair nodded sympathetically and turned to Malik. "Sir, I'm sure you can understand Ms. Ashford's concern. She's been a loyal customer on this route for years, and Seat 1A is part of her regular travel routine. Would you be willing to consider moving to another first-class seat so we can accommodate her preferences?" Malik looked at Blair with the expression of someone trying to determine whether what he was hearing was actually real. "Let me make sure I understand what you're asking. You want me to give up the seat I paid for and reserved so that another passenger can have it because she's used to sitting there?" "It's not quite that simple, sir," Blair said, her tone taking on the practiced condescension that airline employees used when they were trying to make unreasonable requests sound reasonable. Ms. Ashford has specific needs based on her medical condition and her status as one of our most valued customers. I'm sure we can find a solution that works for everyone. Medical condition, Malik repeated, looking at Victoria with new interest. Victoria seized on the opening like a lifeline. Yes, I have chronic back problems that require the specific positioning that only Seat 1A provides. The bulkhead support is essential for my spinal alignment during long flights. It was a masterful performance delivered with just enough medical terminology to sound credible and just enough vulnerability to evoke sympathy. The only problem was that it was complete fabrication and everyone involved knew it. That sounds serious, Malik said with apparent concern. I'm sure the airline has documentation of your medical needs on file, which would explain why they specifically reserved this seat for you, instead of assigning it to another passenger. Blair's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. Sir, I don't think we need to get into the details of medical documentation. This is simply a matter of customer service and ensuring that all passengers have a comfortable flight. I agree completely, Malik said, and I think the best way to ensure that is for everyone to sit in the seat they paid for and reserved. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Richard Stone, a man in his 50s who wore his authority like a uniform and his prejudices like cologne. He had the kind of old-school airline captain presence that belonged to an era when cockpits were boys' clubs and passengers were expected to defer to crew authority without question. What seems to be the problem here? Captain Stone asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being the final arbiter of aircraft disputes. Blair immediately began explaining the situation in terms that painted Victoria as the victim of an uncooperative passenger. She described Malik as difficult and refusing reasonable accommodation requests, while characterizing Victoria as a valued customer with legitimate medical needs. Captain Stone listened with the expression of someone who had already reached his conclusion before hearing all the facts. When Blair finished her presentation, he turned to Malik with barely concealed irritation. Sir, I'm going to need you to work with us here. Ms. Ashford is a regular passenger on this route, and we take care of our regulars. I'm sure we can find you another seat that will be just as comfortable. Such as Malik asked. We have several open seats in business class that would be perfect for you, Captain Stone said. Or if you prefer, we can arrange an upgrade certificate for a future flight as compensation for the inconvenience. Malik let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. Captain, are you asking me to leave first class? I'm asking you to be reasonable, Captain Stone said. Sometimes passengers need to make small accommodations for the comfort and safety of other travelers. And if I refuse, Captain Stone's expression hardened. Then we have a problem. I have the authority to remove passengers who disrupt the flight or refuse to follow crew instructions. I'd prefer not to use that authority, but I will if necessary. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and every passenger within earshot understood that they were witnessing something that had escalated far beyond a simple seating dispute. This was about power and privilege, about who belonged where, and who had the authority to make that determination. Malik pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. Initiate Protocol 7. Authorization Nexus, Alpha 9. Captain Stone noticed the phone, and his expression grew even more stern. Sir, I'm going to need you to put that device away and focus on resolving this situation. I am resolving this situation, Malik said calmly. I'm just doing it in my own way. Victoria, who had been silent during the exchange with the captain, finally found her voice again. Look, this is ridiculous. I need that seat, and he's being completely unreasonable about a simple request. Can't you just move him to economy and be done with it? Economy, Malik repeated, finally, allowing a note of surprise to enter his voice. It's not a punishment, Victoria said quickly, realizing how her suggestion sounded. It's just a practical solution. I'm sure you'll be perfectly comfortable back there." Captain Stone nodded approvingly. "We do have seats available in economy class. It would solve the immediate problem and allow us to depart on schedule." Malik looked around the cabin at the other passengers, most of whom were pretending not to watch while hanging on every word of the confrontation. He saw business travelers hiding behind their phones, families trying to distract their children, and airline employees looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was heading. "Let me ask you a question," Captain Malik said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "If I were a white passenger in an expensive suit, would you be asking me to move to economy class to accommodate another passenger's preferences?" Captain Stone's face flushed red. "Sir, this has nothing to do with race. This is about operational efficiency and customer service." "Is it?" Malik asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like it has everything to do with you, assuming that I'm the kind of passenger who can be moved around to suit your convenience." The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Captain Stone's professional composure began to crack around the edges. "I'm not going to stand here and be accused of discrimination by a passenger who refuses to follow reasonable crew instructions." "Then don't stand here," Malik said simply. "Call security, call the police, call whoever you think you need to call. But understand that, when you do, you're going to have to explain to them why you think I should give up the seat I paid for because a white woman wants it more than I do." Victoria gasped audibly at the direct accusation. "That is not what this is about. You're turning this into something it's not." "Am I?" Malik asked, looking directly at her. "Then explain to me what it is about. Explain to me why your needs are more important than mine. Explain to me why your comfort matters more than my rights. Explain to me why I should be grateful for the opportunity to move to economy class so you can have the seat you want." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in first class was holding their breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Several passengers had their phones out discreetly recording what was clearly going to be either a viral video or evidence in a discrimination lawsuit. Captain Stone checked his watch and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Sir, you have 2 minutes to gather your belongings and move to an economy seat, or I'm calling Port Authority to have you removed from this aircraft. This is your final warning." Malik looked at the captain for a long moment, then at Victoria, then at Blair. Finally, he smiled the kind of smile that should have been a warning, but looked like resignation. "Call them," he said quietly. "Call whoever you want. But Captain, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because in about 10 minutes, you're going to wish you had made a very different decision." Captain Stone's hand moved toward his radio with the deliberate motion of a man crossing a line he could never uncross. The first-class cabin had become a pressure cooker, and every passenger could feel the tension building toward an explosion that would change everything. "This is Captain Stone to gate control," he said into his radio, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "I need Port Authority security to gate B12 immediately. We have a disruptive passenger refusing to follow crew instructions." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped audibly while others leaned forward in their seats to get a better view of the confrontation. Cell phones appeared from pockets and purses as people realized they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Malik remained perfectly still in seat 1, his hands folded calmly in his lap as if he was attending a business meeting rather than being threatened with arrest. The contrast between his peaceful demeanor and the chaos erupting around him was striking, and several passengers later said it was that juxtaposition that made the situation feel so surreal. Disruptive. Malik repeated his voice, carrying just enough surprise to make the captain's characterization sound absurd. "Captain, I've been sitting quietly in my assigned seat reading documents on my tablet. In what way have I been disruptive?" Victoria seized on the question like an opportunity to justify what was happening. You've been arguing with the crew and refusing to follow their instructions. That's disruptive behavior by any reasonable definition. I've been declining to give up the seat I paid for. Malik corrected her. I wasn't aware that was considered disruptive behavior. Blair Whitfield stepped closer to Captain Stone, lowering her voice but not enough to prevent other passengers from overhearing. Captain, he's been confrontational from the moment he boarded. He raised his voice to me and made threats about what would happen if we didn't accommodate his demands. The lie was so bold and so easily disprovable that several passengers actually turned to stare at Blair with expressions of disbelief. Malik had done nothing but speak in measured professional tones throughout the entire confrontation, while Victoria and the crew had been the ones escalating both volume and aggression. That's interesting, Malik said, pulling out his phone again. Because I'm pretty sure that several passengers have been recording this entire interaction. Would you like to review the footage and point out exactly when I raised my voice or made threats? Blair's face went pale as she realized that her attempt to reframe the narrative had backfired spectacularly. In an era where every passenger carried a high-definition camera lying about easily verifiable facts was not just dishonest, it was stupid. Captain Stone, however, was too committed to his course of action to back down gracefully. Sir, I don't need to review any footage. I have my crew's professional assessment of your behavior, and that's sufficient for me to make operational decisions about this aircraft. Your crew's professional assessment, Malik repeated thoughtfully. Would that be the same crew that's asking me to give up my first-class seat to accommodate another passenger's preferences? The crew that suggested I should be grateful for the opportunity to move to economy class. A new voice entered the conversation as Camila Santos, the young Latina flight attendant, who had been watching the confrontation unfold with growing horror, stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but clear as she addressed the captain. Captain Stone, I've been observing this situation from the beginning, and I have to respectfully disagree with Blair's assessment. Mr. Washington has been nothing but polite and reasonable. He hasn't raised his voice, made any threats, or displayed disruptive behavior of any kind. The intervention from an unexpected source sent shockwaves through the immediate area. Blair whirled around to face Camilla with an expression that could have melted steel while Captain Stone's jaw tightened visibly at having his authority questioned by a subordinate crew member. Ms. Santos, Blair said in a voice that dripped with menace, I don't recall asking for your input on this matter. Perhaps you should focus on your assigned duties and let the senior crew handle passenger issues. My assigned duty is passenger safety, Camila replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. And I don't believe removing a passenger who has done nothing wrong serves the safety interests of anyone on this aircraft. Victoria had been growing increasingly agitated as the situation spiraled beyond her control. What had started as a simple request for her preferred seat had turned into a public spectacle that was making her look like the villain in her own story. This is insane, she declared, her voice rising to a pitch that made other passengers wince. I am trying to resolve a simple seating issue, and now we have crew members arguing with each other and passengers recording everything like this is some kind of entertainment show. She turned to face the cabin full of watching passengers, her arms spread wide in a gesture of exasperated appeal. Does anyone else think this is reasonable? I've been flying this route for years. I have legitimate medical needs that require a specific seat assignment. And this man is refusing to make a simple accommodation that would solve everyone's problems. The silence that greeted her appeal was deafening. Several passengers looked uncomfortable, but no one voiced support for her position. In fact, an elderly businessman in seat 3A cleared his throat and spoke up in a voice that carried the authority of someone used to being listened to. Ma'am, I've been flying for 40 years and I've never seen a passenger ask to give up their assigned first-class seat because another passenger preferred it. If you needed a specific seat for medical reasons, shouldn't you have requested it when you made your reservation? The question hit Victoria like a slap in the face, forcing her to confront the logical flaw in her entire argument. If Seat 1A was truly medically necessary for her comfort, why hadn't she ensured she would have access to it before arriving at the airport? I shouldn't have to explain my personal medical situation to satisfy your curiosity. Victoria snapped her tone, revealing the desperation she was trying to hide. Some of us have privacy concerns about our health information. Then perhaps you should have discussed those privacy concerns with the airline's medical accommodation department when you booked your ticket. The businessman replied coolly. Captain Stone could see that the situation was rapidly slipping beyond his control. What should have been a simple exercise of cockpit authority was turning into a public relations nightmare that was being recorded by multiple passengers. He needed to regain control of the narrative before it became a viral video that destroyed his career. Everyone needs to calm down and let me handle this situation, he announced, his voice booming across the cabin. Mr. Washington, you have 30 seconds to gather your belongings and move to the seat we've provided for you, or I'm having you removed from this aircraft. What seat have you provided for me? Malik asked, with what sounded like genuine curiosity. Seat 23, F, Blair said quickly, consulting her tablet. It's an economy seat with extra legroom. In the middle of the plane, Malik observed. Between two other passengers. After I paid for a first-class window seat. It's a perfectly comfortable seat, Captain Stone said impatiently. And it's what's available. Malik nodded thoughtfully and stood up from seat 1A. For a moment, Victoria looked triumphant, believing that she had finally gotten her way through sheer persistence and the backing of the flight crew. She moved toward the seat with obvious satisfaction, already mentally claiming the territory she had fought so hard to win. But instead of gathering his belongings, Malik pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. James Mitchell. Please, he said into the phone, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin. This is Malik Washington. Tell him it's urgent. The name James Mitchell meant nothing to most of the passengers, but Captain Stone and Blair exchanged glances that suggested it meant something to them. James Mitchell was Skyline Airlines Vice President of Operations, the man who could end careers with a phone call. James? Yes, I'm calling from Flight 847. We have a situation here that requires your immediate attention. Victoria paused halfway to seat 1. Suddenly unsure whether her victory was as complete as she had thought. There was something in Malik's tone that suggested this phone call was not a complaint or a request for intervention. It sounded more like a command. I'm being removed from my assigned first-class seat by crew members who are accommodating another passenger's preferences over my confirmed reservation. The captain has threatened to have me arrested if I don't move to economy class. Malik paused, listening to something on the other end of the call. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, still calm, but with an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the cabin pay closer attention. James, I need you to ground this aircraft immediately. No, I'm not asking for a delay. I'm ordering you to ground it. Authorization code, Nexus, Alpha 9. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound in the cabin was the hum of the aircraft's electrical systems. Even Victoria stopped moving, her hand frozen on the back of seat 1A as she tried to process what she had just heard. Captain Stone stepped closer to Malik, his face red with anger and confusion. Sir, you can't just call someone and order an aircraft grounded. That's not how airlines work. Malik smiled and handed the phone to Captain Stone. Why don't you explain that to James Mitchell? Captain Stone took the phone with the confidence of a man who was about to school a delusional passenger on the realities of airline operations. His expression suggested that he was looking forward to the conversation with James Mitchell, viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority and have Malik's behavior officially documented. Mr. Mitchell, this is Captain Stone on Flight 847. I have a passenger here who seems to think he can ground my aircraft by making phone calls to corporate. The change in Captain Stone's expression was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his face so quickly that several passengers later compared it to watching a balloon deflate in real time. His confident posture collapsed, his shoulders sagged, and his hand began to tremble slightly as he listened to whatever James Mitchell was telling him. "Sir, I don't understand. What do you mean he owns the airline?" The words hit the first-class cabin like a bomb going off. Victoria's hand slipped from the back of seat 1A, and she actually staggered backward as if she had been physically struck. Blair Whitfield made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a moan, while Camilla Santos struggled to suppress what looked suspiciously like a smile. Captain Stone continued listening to his phone, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and growing panic. "The acquisition was finalized this morning, and he's the new owner of Skyline Airlines." "The entire company." Malik gently took his phone back from the captain's nerveless fingers. "Thanks, James. I'll speak with you more when we're back at the gate." He ended the call and looked around the cabin at the faces staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to outright terror. When he spoke, his voice was calm and conversational, as if he was discussing the weather rather than revealing that he owned every bolt and rivet on the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your travel plans. My name is Malik Washington, and as of 9 o'clock this morning, I am the owner and CEO of Skyline Airlines. I had hoped to experience our service as a regular passenger, but it seems that won't be possible today." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of someone's coffee cup hitting the floor as their nerveless fingers lost the ability to hold on to it. Victoria stood frozen in the aisle like a statue, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Blair Whitfield was the first to find her voice, and when she spoke, it came out as a desperate whisper. "Mr. Washington, we had no idea. If we had known." "If you had known what?" Malik asked with genuine curiosity. "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently. You would have respected my right to sit in the seat I paid for." "That's not what I meant," Blair said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then what did you mean?" Malik asked. "Because what I experienced today was a flight crew that assumed a black passenger in casual clothes must be someone who could be moved around to accommodate the preferences of a white passenger who felt entitled to his seat." Captain Stone was still processing the reality of his situation, his mind racing through the career-ending implications of what had just transpired. "Mr. Washington, sir, I was simply following standard protocols for handling passenger disputes. I had no way of knowing about your position with the company." "My position with the company is irrelevant," Malik said firmly. "What's relevant is that you threatened to have a paying passenger arrested for refusing to give up the seat he had rightfully purchased. Would you have made that same threat if I had been a white passenger in an expensive suit?" The question hung in the air like an accusation that no one could deny. Several passengers were nodding their heads in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable with the direct confrontation with the racism they had just witnessed. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. "Mr. Washington, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I never meant to imply that you didn't belong in first class. This was simply about my medical needs and my familiarity with this particular seat." Malik turned his attention to Victoria with the kind of focus that made her take an involuntary step backward. "Ms. Ashford, isn't it? Tell me about your medical condition that specifically requires Seat 1A. I have back problems that require the bulkhead support." Victoria stammered, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Interesting," Malik said thoughtfully. "Because I just reviewed your passenger profile in our system, and there's no record of any medical accommodation requests. In fact, there's no indication that you've ever submitted documentation for any health-related seating requirements." Victoria's face went white as she realized that her fabricated medical excuse had just been exposed as a lie in front of a cabin full of witnesses. But more interesting, Malik continued, is what our security team found when they ran a background check on your travel patterns. It seems you've been using this route to transport sensitive financial documents that exist in some very questionable legal gray areas. The accusation hit Victoria like a physical blow, and she actually staggered against a nearby seat for support. Blair and Captain Stone looked confused, but several passengers were beginning to understand that this situation involved much more than a simple seating dispute. That's completely false, Victoria said, but her voice lacked any conviction. Is it? Malik asked. He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen, which displayed what looked like financial records and flight manifests. Because according to our records, you've made this exact journey 23 times in the past year, always in Seat 1A, always carrying documents that you declare as personal papers rather than business materials. Victoria's legs gave out and she collapsed into the nearest available seat, which happened to be 2C, the seat she had originally rejected as unacceptable. The irony was lost on no one. Mr. Washington, Captain Stone said desperately, I think there may be some confusion about the sequence of events here. If I had known about your ownership of the company, you would have done what Malik interrupted. Treated me with respect. Followed proper procedures. Upheld my rights as a paying passenger. Captain Stone opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was obvious to everyone in the cabin. He would have treated Malik completely differently if he had known about his wealth and power, which proved exactly the point that Malik was making about discrimination and bias. Here's what's going to happen, Malik said, his voice taking on the authority of someone used to making decisions that affected thousands of people. This aircraft is going to return to the gate. Captain Stone, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Blair, your employment with Skyline Airlines is terminated. Please gather your personal belongings and prepare to deplane. The announcements hit the cabin like a series of explosions. Blair began crying openly while Captain Stone's face went through a rapid series of expressions as he processed the reality that his career had just ended. Sir Captain Stone pleaded, I have 22 years of experience with this airline. I have a family, a mortgage responsibilities. Surely we can discuss this situation and reach some kind of understanding. You should have thought about those responsibilities before you threatened to have me arrested for sitting in my own seat, Malik replied. Your employment is terminated for cause. Security will escort you from the aircraft. Blair was hyperventilating as the reality of her situation sank in. Mr. Washington, please, I have 2 children. I can't lose my job over a misunderstanding. I was just trying to provide good customer service to a regular passenger. You were trying to provide preferential treatment to a passenger based on her race and your assumptions about my background, Malik corrected her. That's not customer service. That's discrimination. Camila Santos stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her. Mr. Washington, for what it's worth, I want to apologize on behalf of the crew members who actually care about treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Malik looked at the young flight attendant and smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Ms. Santos, isn't it? You're the only crew member who spoke up for what was right, even when it put you at risk with your supervisors. I won't forget that. The aircraft's intercom system crackled to life as the voice of air traffic control came through the speakers. Skyline 847, you are cleared to return to Gate B12. Ground crew and security personnel are standing by. As the plane began its slow taxi back to the gate, the passengers sat in stunned silence processing what they had just witnessed. Several were frantically typing on their phones, sharing the story with friends and family, while others were uploading the videos they had recorded to social media. Victoria sat slumped in seat 2C, her head in her hands, as she realized that her entire life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. The documents in her carry-on bag, which had seemed so important an hour earlier, now felt like evidence in a criminal case that was building against her. Blair and Captain Stone gathered their personal belongings with the mechanical movements of people in shock, their faces showing the devastating realization that their careers in aviation were over. 20-plus years of experience meant nothing when weighed against a viral video of them discriminating against the owner of the airline. As the aircraft pulled up to the gate, Malik remained calm and composed in seat 1. Reading something on his tablet as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But his mind was racing with the implications of what would happen next, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire airline industry. The door to the aircraft opened and airport security personnel began boarding, followed by what appeared to be federal agents in dark suits. Victoria looked up from her hands as she heard official-sounding voices discussing financial crimes and document seizure, and she realized that her nightmare was just beginning. The conference room at Chicago O'Hare's administrative offices had been hastily converted into a command center with Malik Washington at its epicenter, orchestrating what would later be described as the most comprehensive corporate response to discrimination in airline industry history. James Mitchell Skyline. Airline's VP of Operations sat across from Malik with the expression of a man trying to process information that defied his understanding of how business worked. The acquisition paperwork spread across the table between them represented more than just a change in ownership. It represented a complete upheaval of everything he thought he knew about power and accountability. The legal department confirms that all filing requirements were completed at 9:47 this morning. James said, his voice still carrying traces of disbelief. You officially became the majority shareholder and CEO of Skyline Airlines approximately 30 minutes before Flight 847 was scheduled to depart. Malik nodded without looking up from his laptop, where he was simultaneously monitoring social media reactions, reviewing personnel files, and coordinating with his legal team. And the crew assignments for Flight 847, Captain Richard Stone has been with the company for 22 years, Blair Whitfield for 15 years. Both have clean personnel files, no previous disciplinary actions, commendations for customer service. Dig deeper. Malik said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Clean files usually mean effective cover-ups, not exemplary behavior. I want to know about every passenger complaint, every crew report, every incident that might have been buried or dismissed. James pulled out his phone and began making calls to the Human Resources Department while Malik opened a video conference with his executive team back in Detroit. The faces on his screen showed the kind of focused intensity that came from people who understood they were witnessing history being made. Talk to me about the financial investigation, Malik said to the woman who appeared on his screen. Sarah Kim, his chief legal counsel, had the sharp features and sharper mind that had made her one of the most feared corporate lawyers in the country. We ran Victoria Ashford's name through our financial monitoring systems, Sarah said, her voice crisp and professional. She's been flagged by the SEC for suspicious trading patterns involving airline stocks. The documents she's been carrying on these flights appear to be insider trading evidence that she's been using to manipulate market positions. How long has this been going on? Based on flight records and trading data, approximately 18 months. She's been using advanced knowledge of airline industry developments to make strategic investments before the information becomes public. Malik felt the familiar rush of pieces clicking into place that he experienced when solving complex business problems. So she needed Seat 1A not just for comfort but for operational security. The bulkhead position would give her privacy to review sensitive documents without other passengers seeing them. That's our assessment, Sarah confirmed. And the crew's willingness to accommodate her preferences suggests they may have been compensated for ensuring her access to that specific seat. James Mitchell looked up from his phone calls with an expression that suggested he had just received very disturbing information. Mr. Washington, I think you need to hear this. I just spoke with our HR director about Captain Stone and Blair Whitfield. Go ahead. There have been 17 formal complaints filed against them over the past 3 years, all involving discriminatory treatment of minority passengers, all dismissed or downgraded to customer service coaching by the previous management. The silence in the room was deafening as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding between passengers. It was evidence of a pattern of discrimination that had been enabled and protected by airline management. "What about Camila Santos?" Malik asked. 3 commendations for exceptional passenger service. 2 reports filed with HR about witnessing discriminatory behavior by senior crew members. Both reports resulted in her being counseled about maintaining crew unity rather than any investigation of her allegations. Malik closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, his mind processing the implications of what he was learning. The discrimination he had experienced wasn't just personal bias. It was institutional rot that had been allowed to fester for years. "James, I want you to ground every flight where Captain Stone or Blair Whitfield are scheduled to work. I want their crew assignments reviewed for the past 2 years, and I want interviews scheduled with every passenger who filed complaints that were dismissed. Sir, that's going to affect dozens of flights and potentially thousands of passengers. Then we'll provide accommodations, rebooking, and compensation for every affected passenger. The cost of doing the right thing is always less than the cost of doing the wrong thing." Malik's phone buzzed with a text message from airport security, Victoria Ashford in custody, documents seized, FBI taking over investigation. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the gate area where Flight 847 was still parked. Ground crew were removing luggage while federal agents conducted what appeared to be a thorough search of the aircraft. News vans were already gathering in the parking area, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metal flowers following the sun. "The story is already going viral," Sarah said from the video conference screen. "Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Videos from passengers are getting millions of views. The hashtag #SkylineJustice is trending worldwide. What's the sentiment analysis showing overwhelmingly positive for you and the company's response? People are calling it corporate accountability at its finest. There's also significant discussion about the broader issues of discrimination in air travel." Malik nodded, understanding that they had reached a critical moment where their response would define not just the company's reputation, but potentially influence industry-wide changes in how discrimination was addressed. "Schedule a press conference for 6 o'clock tonight," he said. "I want to address this situation directly and announce the changes we're implementing immediately." "What changes?" James asked. "Complete overhaul of our anti-discrimination policies. Zero-tolerance enforcement. Bias training for all crew members. Anonymous reporting systems for both passengers and crew. Financial compensation for every passenger who has experienced discrimination on our flights." "Sir, the financial liability alone could be what expensive? Do you know what's more expensive than compensating victims of discrimination, defending against federal civil rights lawsuits while our stock price collapses and our reputation is destroyed?" Malik pulled out his phone and placed a call that connected him to the FBI agent overseeing Victoria Ashford's arrest. The conversation was brief, but illuminating, confirming that the documents in her possession contained evidence of securities fraud that extended far beyond airline insider trading. "Agent Rodriguez, I want to make sure you have complete access to all Skyline Airlines records that might be relevant to your investigation. We will cooperate fully with any federal inquiry into how this situation was allowed to continue." When he ended the call, James was staring at him with an expression of something approaching awe. "Sir, you've been the owner of this company for less than 6 hours, and you've already fired crew members, grounded flights, launched an internal investigation, and volunteered to cooperate with a federal criminal case. James, let me explain something to you about leadership." Malik said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of building companies and managing crises. "Power isn't about protecting the status quo. Power is about having the ability to change things that are wrong and the courage to use that ability. He gathered his laptop and papers, preparing to return to the gate area where reporters and passengers were waiting for answers. I didn't buy Skyline Airlines to maintain the same culture that allowed discrimination to flourish. I bought it to prove that a major corporation can operate with dignity, respect, and accountability. As they left the conference room, James asked the question that had been bothering him since the first phone call. "Mr. Washington, how did you know? How did you know that calling me would result in all of this?" Malik smiled, the first genuine expression of satisfaction he had shown all day. "James, I've been planning this acquisition for 8 months. I've researched every aspect of this company's operations, including crew assignments, passenger complaints, and financial irregularities. I knew exactly who was working Flight 847 today, and I had a pretty good idea of how they would respond to a black passenger in a hoodie who didn't show proper deference to their authority." "You set them up," James said, his voice filled with something between admiration and concern. "I gave them the opportunity to do the right thing," Malik corrected him. "They chose to do the wrong thing, and now they're facing the consequences of that choice." As they walked toward the gate, Malik could see Victoria Ashford being escorted through the terminal in handcuffs, her expensive clothes and perfect hair looking wildly out of place as federal agents guided her toward a waiting car. Blair Whitfield and Captain Stone were sitting in airport security offices, presumably being interviewed about their roles in what was rapidly becoming a federal case. The transformation from routine flight to federal investigation had taken less than 4 hours, but Malik understood that the real work was just beginning. Changing a corporate culture required more than firing the worst offenders. It required building new systems, training new behaviors, and creating accountability measures that would prevent future discrimination. But for now, he was satisfied with the knowledge that Victoria Ashford would never again use her privilege to humiliate another passenger, and Captain Stone and Blair Whitfield would never again threaten to arrest someone for refusing to give up a seat they had rightfully purchased. Justice Malik reflected as he prepared to face the media circus waiting for him didn't always come quickly. But when it did, it was beautiful to watch. The gate area around Flight 847 had transformed into something resembling a movie set with news crews setting up cameras, federal agents coordinating investigations, and passengers sharing their videos with anyone who would watch. The ordinary Tuesday morning had become the kind of viral news event that would be discussed in business schools and civil rights seminars for years to come. Malik Washington walked through the chaos with the calm confidence of someone who had orchestrated corporate crises before, but never one that involved his own company and his own experience of discrimination. Airport security had established a perimeter around the gate, but reporters were calling out questions from beyond the barriers, their voices blending into a cacophony of curiosity and ambition. James Mitchell stayed close to Malik's side, fielding phone calls from corporate headquarters, government agencies, and what seemed like every news organization in the country. The acquisition of Skyline Airlines had been planned as a routine business announcement for the following morning, but circumstances had accelerated the timeline in ways that no one could have anticipated. Mr. Washington called out a reporter from CNN, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "Can you confirm that you purchased Skyline Airlines this morning and then experienced discrimination on your first flight as the owner?" Malik paused and turned toward the reporter, recognizing that this moment would likely define how the story was told and understood by the public. "I can confirm that Nexus Dynamics completed the acquisition of Skyline Airlines this morning. I can also confirm that I experienced exactly the kind of treatment that no passenger should experience on any airline." What specifically happened on that flight, another reporter called out. "I was asked to give up my assigned first-class seat to accommodate another passenger's preferences. When I declined, I was threatened with arrest and removal from the aircraft." The crew's assumption seemed to be that a black man in casual clothes was the kind of passenger who could be moved around to suit their convenience. The reporter scribbled frantically, understanding that they were witnessing a story that combined corporate drama, civil rights issues, and viral social media content into a perfect storm of national attention. "What action are you taking against the crew members involved?" asked a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. "The captain and purser have been terminated for cause." But this isn't just about individual crew members. This is about changing a culture that allowed discrimination to be treated as normal customer service. Behind the security perimeter, Victoria Ashford was being loaded into a federal vehicle, her hands cuffed behind her back as FBI agents handled what appeared to be boxes of evidence. Several passengers from Flight 847 were watching the proceedings with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction, many of them still processing the revelation that they had witnessed the owner of the airline being discriminated against by his own employees. Camila Santos appeared at Malik's side, having changed out of her flight attendant uniform into civilian clothes. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "Mr. Washington, I want you to know that not everyone who works for this airline thinks the way Captain Stone and Blair did. Some of us have been trying to speak up about these issues for years." Malik turned his full attention to the young woman, recognizing that her willingness to contradict her supervisors during the confrontation had taken genuine courage. "Ms. Santos, I remember what you did on that plane. You stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to stay silent." "I couldn't stay silent anymore," Camila said. "I've watched too many passengers be treated poorly because of their race or their appearance or their accent. Today was the first time I had the chance to say something that might actually matter." "It did matter," Malik assured her, "and I want you to know that your courage won't be forgotten when we rebuild this company's culture." James Mitchell approached them with his phone pressed to his ear, his expression indicating that he was receiving important information. When he ended the call, his face was grim. "Mr. Washington, that was our security department. They've completed the preliminary investigation into Captain Stone and Blair Whitfield's personnel files. What did they find? Evidence that they've been coordinating passenger accommodations based on factors that violate federal anti-discrimination laws. Phone records show multiple conversations with Victoria Ashford about ensuring she had access to Seat 1A, including discussions about how to handle problem passengers who might occupy it. The revelation hit like another bombshell, confirming what Malik had suspected about the crew's relationship with Victoria. This wasn't just about bias or customer service preferences. It was about a coordinated effort to provide preferential treatment based on race and class. "There's more," James continued. "Our financial investigation team found evidence that Victoria Ashford has been compensating crew members for special accommodations, not through official channels but through personal payments that were designed to avoid corporate oversight." Malik felt the familiar surge of anger that came from discovering corruption, but he channeled it into the cold focus that had made him successful in business. "So we have federal crimes, corporate policy violations, and civil rights violations all wrapped up in one neat package." "It appears so, yes, sir." The crowd of reporters had grown larger as news of the story spread, and Malik could see television crews setting up for live broadcasts that would carry the story to national and international audiences. Social media was already exploding with passenger videos, expert commentary, and public outrage about discrimination in air travel. His phone buzzed with a text from his chief of communications back in Detroit. "Sir, we need to get ahead of this story. Every major news outlet is requesting interviews. Twitter engagement is off the charts. This is becoming a defining moment for corporate accountability." Malik typed back quickly. "Schedule interviews with major networks for tonight. Focus on company changes, not personal grievances. This is about systemic change, not individual revenge." He looked around the gate area one more time, taking in the scene of controlled chaos that had erupted from what should have been a routine flight. Passengers were giving interviews to reporters, federal agents were coordinating evidence collection, and airline employees were trying to manage the logistics of rebooking hundreds of affected travelers. James Otis, I want you to personally call every passenger who was on Flight 847 today. Full refunds, future travel credits, and written apologies from me personally. They didn't sign up to be part of this story, and they deserve to be compensated for the disruption. Yes, sir. And what about the crew members who were terminated? They're requesting meetings with union representatives and legal counsel. They're entitled to due process through their union contracts, but the terminations stand. Document everything, follow all legal procedures, but understand that there is zero tolerance for discrimination in this company going forward. As Malik prepared to leave the gate area for the press conference that would define his company's response to the crisis, he received one final update from the FBI agent handling Victoria Ashford's case. Mr. Washington, I wanted you to know that Miss Ashford has been charged with securities, fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The documents she was carrying contained evidence of insider trading schemes that may have affected multiple airlines and investment firms. What's the potential sentence if convicted on all charges? She's looking at 20 to 25 years in federal prison. The financial damages appear to be in the tens of millions of dollars. Malik ended the call and reflected on how quickly someone's life could change based on the choices they made. Victoria Ashford had woken up that morning as a successful hedge fund executive. She would go to sleep that night in federal custody, facing decades in prison for crimes that had been enabled by her sense of entitlement and her assumption that she could treat people as obstacles to be removed. The irony wasn't lost on him that her determination to claim Seat 1A had led directly to the exposure of criminal activities that might have continued for years if she had simply accepted the seat she had been assigned. Justice, he mused as he walked toward the press conference, sometimes came in unexpected packages. The press conference room at Chicago O'Hare Airport had been hastily converted from a routine airline briefing space into the epicenter of what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant corporate accountability stories of the decade. Every major news network had sent crews. Financial reporters were analyzing stock market implications in real time, and social media was exploding with commentary about discrimination, justice, and corporate responsibility. Malik Washington stood behind the podium with the composed confidence of someone who had managed corporate crises before, but never one that involved such a personal intersection of business ownership and civil rights. The Skyline Airlines logo behind him seemed to gleam under the television lights, as if the company itself was being reborn in the glare of public scrutiny. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention during what I know has been an unusual and rapidly developing situation. Malik began, his voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. This morning, Nexus Dynamics completed the acquisition of Skyline Airlines, making me the majority shareholder and CEO of the company. This afternoon, I experienced firsthand the kind of discrimination that no passenger should face on any airline. The reporters leaned forward, understanding that they were witnessing a story that combined high-stakes business drama with fundamental questions about equality and justice in American corporate culture. I was asked to give up my assigned first-class seat to accommodate another passenger's preferences. When I declined to do so, I was threatened with arrest and removal from the aircraft by crew members who assumed that a black man in casual clothes was someone who could be moved around to suit their convenience. Hands shot up around the room as reporters prepared to ask questions, but Malik continued speaking, understanding the importance of controlling the narrative from the beginning. The crew members involved in this incident, Captain Richard Stone and flight attendant Blair Whitfield, have been terminated for cause, but their termination is not the end of our response. It's the beginning of a comprehensive overhaul of how this company addresses discrimination and ensures dignity for all passengers. Mr. Washington called out a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. What specific changes are you implementing to prevent future incidents? Effective immediately. Skyline Airlines is instituting a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Every crew member will undergo comprehensive bias training. We're establishing anonymous reporting systems for passengers and employees to report discriminatory behavior. And we're creating a victim compensation fund for passengers who have experienced discrimination on our flights." "What about the financial impact of these changes?" asked a reporter from CNBC. "The financial impact of doing the right thing is always less than the cost of doing the wrong thing," Malik replied. "Discrimination is not just morally wrong, it's bad business. We're prepared to invest whatever resources are necessary to ensure that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect." A reporter from CNN raised her hand. "Can you tell us about Victoria Ashford, the passenger who was arrested in connection with this incident?" Malik paused, understanding that this part of the story was particularly sensitive given the ongoing federal investigation. "Ms. Ashford has been arrested by federal agents on charges related to financial crimes that appear to have been enabled by her preferential treatment on our flights. I can't comment on the specifics of the criminal case, but I can say that her arrest demonstrates the importance of treating all passengers equally, regardless of their perceived status or influence." "What was your emotional response to being discriminated against by employees of the company you now own?" asked a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. For the first time during the press conference, Malik allowed a personal note to enter his voice. "I was disappointed but not surprised. As a black man in America, I've experienced discrimination before, including in airline travel. What was unique about this situation was that I had the power to do something about it immediately and comprehensively. Are you concerned about the viral nature of the passenger videos and the public reaction on social media?" "I'm grateful for the passenger videos, actually. They provide indisputable evidence of what happened and help ensure that the story can't be distorted or minimized. Sunlight is the best disinfectant for discrimination." In the back of the room, James Mitchell was fielding calls from reporters, government agencies, and airline industry analysts who were trying to understand the broader implications of what was happening. The stock market had already begun reacting to the news, with Skyline Airlines shares fluctuating wildly as investors tried to assess whether the controversy would help or hurt the company's long-term prospects. Meanwhile, in a federal holding facility across town, Victoria Ashford was experiencing the full weight of her new reality. The expensive clothes that had made her feel powerful that morning now felt like costume pieces from a play she no longer understood. Her platinum hair was disheveled from the arrest process, and her manicured hands were shaking as she tried to process the speed with which her world had collapsed. Her phone call to her lawyer had been brief and devastating. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The charges were serious, and her chances of avoiding federal prison were minimal. The insider trading scheme that had seemed so clever when she was profiting from it now looked like the criminal conspiracy it had always been. "My client is prepared to cooperate fully with the federal investigation." Her lawyer had told the FBI agents, understanding that cooperation was Victoria's only hope for a reduced sentence. She recognizes the seriousness of the charges and wants to make amends for her actions. Back at O'Hare, Blair Whitfield was sitting in an airport security office, still wearing her flight attendant uniform, but no longer looking like someone with authority over anything. Her 20-year career with Skyline Airlines was over, and the viral videos of her discriminatory behavior would make finding another job in the airline industry virtually impossible. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she kept repeating to the union representative who had been called to advise her. "I was just trying to provide good customer service to a regular passenger. I had no idea who Mr. Washington was." "That's exactly the problem," the union rep replied bluntly. "You provided different levels of service based on your assumptions about passengers' backgrounds and importance. That's textbook discrimination regardless of whether you knew he owned the company." Captain Richard Stone was in a similar situation, his 22-year career effectively ended by a series of decisions that had seemed routine at the time but looked inexcusable in retrospect. His threat to have Malik arrested for sitting in his assigned seat was captured on multiple passenger videos, making it impossible to deny or minimize his role in the discrimination. I followed standard procedures for handling passenger disputes, he insisted to his union representative, but even he could hear how hollow the defense sounded. Standard procedures don't include threatening to arrest passengers for refusing to give up seats they've paid for, came the reply. You let your assumptions about that passenger override your judgment and your training. Back at the press conference, Malik was fielding questions about the broader implications of the incident for the airline industry as a whole. Do you think this is an isolated incident, or is discrimination a widespread problem in air travel? Asked a reporter from USA Today. Based on the research we've done into passenger complaints and industry patterns, I believe discrimination in air travel is more common than most people realize. It's often subtle, disguised as customer service decisions or operational requirements, which makes it hard to identify and address. What do you hope other airlines will take away from this situation? I hope they'll recognize that discrimination isn't just a moral issue, it's a business risk. In an era where every passenger has a high-definition camera and access to social media, discriminatory behavior will be exposed and will have consequences. Airlines that don't address these issues proactively will find themselves addressing them reactively, which is much more expensive and damaging. As the press conference concluded, Malik found himself surrounded by a swarm of reporters asking follow-up questions, seeking exclusive interviews, and requesting additional comments. James Mitchell appeared at his side, guiding him through the crowd toward a waiting car. "Sir, the response has been overwhelming," James said as they settled into the vehicle. "Our customer service lines are flooded with calls, most of them supportive. Social media engagement is through the roof. The Passenger Compensation Fund has already received donations from people who want to support discrimination victims. What about industry reaction mixed? Some competitors are criticizing us for making a public spectacle of internal issues. Others are announcing their own anti-discrimination initiatives, probably to avoid being compared unfavorably to our response." Malik nodded, understanding that the ripple effects of the day's events would continue expanding for weeks or months to come. Changing corporate culture was never easy, but sometimes crisis created opportunities for transformation that would never exist under normal circumstances. As their car pulled away from the airport, Malik could see news vans still gathered around the terminal, reporters still broadcasting live updates about the story that had begun with a simple request for a seat and had evolved into a national conversation about equality, justice, and corporate accountability. The real work of change was just beginning, but for the first time in his career, Malik felt like he was using his wealth and power for something that mattered beyond profit margins and market share. He was proving that business success and moral leadership weren't mutually exclusive. They were mutually reinforcing when done correctly. The Federal Building in downtown Chicago had become the nerve center for what was rapidly expanding into one of the most complex white-collar criminal investigations in recent memory. Victoria Ashford's arrest had opened a door into a world of financial corruption that stretched far beyond a simple airline seating dispute, revealing connections that surprised even experienced federal investigators. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez had been working financial crimes for 15 years, but she had never seen a case that began with viral social media videos and evolved into securities fraud charges within the span of a single afternoon. The evidence seized from Victoria's carry-on bag read like a textbook example of how insider trading schemes operated in the modern economy. The documents show a sophisticated network of information sharing between airline executives, hedge fund managers, and corporate insiders, Agent Rodriguez explained to her supervisor as they reviewed the initial findings. Ashford was using her regular flights to coordinate trading strategies based on advanced knowledge of mergers, acquisitions, and operational changes. How long has this been going on? Based on the paper trail, at least 18 months. Possibly longer if they were using electronic communications that we haven't discovered yet. The investigation had uncovered a level of coordination between Victoria and certain Skyline Airlines crew members that went far beyond simple customer service preferences. Phone records showed regular communication between Victoria and Captain Stone, as well as financial transfers that suggested she was paying for information and accommodation that gave her advantages in her trading activities. Captain Stone was providing her with advance notice of route changes, equipment upgrades, and operational decisions that could affect stock prices. Agent Rodriguez continued. In exchange, he was receiving payments through a shell company that Ashford controlled. What about the flight attendant Blair Whitfield? Similar arrangement. She was ensuring that Ashford had privacy and access to specific seating arrangements that allowed her to conduct sensitive financial communications without observation. The bulkhead seat wasn't just about comfort, it was about operational security for her trading activities. Back at Skyline Airlines headquarters, Malik was receiving updates on the internal investigation that was revealing the scope of corruption within his newly acquired company. The picture emerging was worse than he had initially suspected, showing a culture where preferential treatment for certain passengers was not just tolerated, but institutionalized. We've identified at least 12 other passengers who received similar accommodations from Captain Stone and his crew, reported Sarah Kim, his chief legal counsel, during a video conference from Detroit. All wealthy, all white, all receiving services that went beyond standard airline policies. What kind of services? Advance boarding seat upgrades without payment, special meal accommodations, and most importantly, privacy protections that allowed them to conduct business activities that should have been subject to regulatory oversight. Malik rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of realizing that his acquisition had uncovered criminal activities that could expose the company to massive legal liability. What's our exposure here potentially significant? If the company's facilities and employees were used to facilitate securities fraud, we could face civil penalties from the SEC and criminal charges if prosecutors determined there was institutional knowledge of the activities. But we just bought the company this morning. How can we be held responsible for activities that predated our ownership? That's the million-dollar question. Our legal team is researching precedents for situations where new ownership discovers criminal activities by previous management. The good news is that our immediate response and cooperation with federal investigators should work in our favor. Meanwhile, the media coverage of the story was evolving from simple viral video content into serious investigative journalism as reporters began connecting the dots between Victoria's arrest and broader patterns of corruption in the financial services industry. The Wall Street Journal had assigned a team of investigative reporters to examine the connections between airline operations and securities trading, while the Securities and Exchange Commission had opened its own parallel investigation. Victoria Ashford's cooperation with federal investigators was providing a roadmap to criminal activities that extended far beyond her own actions. In exchange for a potential reduction in her sentence, she was detailing how airline industry insiders had been sharing non-public information with hedge funds and investment firms for years. The arrangement with Captain Stone started small, Victoria told investigators during her first formal interview. Just asking for specific seat assignments so I could have privacy for phone calls. But once he realized I was willing to pay for special treatment, he began offering information about route changes, aircraft maintenance issues, anything that might affect the company's stock price. How many other people were involved in this scheme? At least 6 other fund managers that I know of, probably more. Stone had relationships with multiple passengers who were paying for information and special accommodations. The revelations were sending shockwaves through the airline industry as investigators began examining whether similar arrangements existed at other carriers. The Federal Aviation Administration had launched its own review of crew assignment procedures and passenger accommodation policies, looking for patterns that might indicate systematic corruption. For Camila Santos, the young flight attendant who had spoken up during the original confrontation, the expanding investigation was validation of concerns she had been raising for months. She had noticed the special treatment that certain passengers received, but her attempts to report inappropriate behavior had been dismissed by management as misunderstanding customer service priorities. I tried to tell my supervisors that something wasn't right about how Captain Stone interacted with some passengers, Camilla told investigators during her interview. But I was told that senior crew members had discretion to provide enhanced service to valued customers. Did you ever witness financial transactions or discussions about payment for special treatment? Not directly, but I saw Blair receive envelopes from passengers, including Ms. Ashford. When I asked about it, I was told they were thank you cards for good service, but the envelopes looked too thick for greeting cards. The investigation was also revealing the extent to which Victoria's discriminatory behavior was connected to her criminal activities. Her insistence on maintaining control over Siet 1A wasn't just about personal preference. It was about protecting a criminal enterprise that depended on privacy and predictability. She couldn't afford to have her routine disrupted. Agent Rodriguez explained to prosecutors as they prepared the case against Victoria. Her trading activities required specific communication schedules and privacy protections that would have been compromised if she had been forced to sit in a different location or deal with unexpected passengers nearby. The irony was not lost on investigators that Victoria's racist assumptions about Malik had led directly to the exposure of her criminal activities. If she had simply accepted her assigned seat or treated him with basic courtesy, her insider trading scheme might have continued indefinitely. As news of the investigation spread, other victims of discrimination on Skyline Airlines flights began coming forward with their own stories. The passenger compensation fund that Malik had established was receiving dozens of claims from people who had experienced similar treatment from Captain Stone's crew and other airline employees. The patterns are remarkably consistent, reported the law firm handling victim compensation claims. Passengers of color being asked to give up premium seats, being subjected to additional security scrutiny, or being provided inferior service compared to white passengers in similar circumstances. The financial impact of the scandal was beginning to affect other airlines, as well as investors worried about the potential for similar corruption at competing carriers. Stock prices across the industry were fluctuating as analysts tried to assess which companies might be vulnerable to regulatory investigation. But for Malik, the most significant revelation was the extent to which his own experience of discrimination had been connected to a broader criminal conspiracy. What had felt like personal prejudice was actually part of a systematic effort to maintain privileges that enabled illegal activities. This wasn't just about racism, he told his executive team during an emergency meeting. This was about protecting a criminal enterprise that depended on discriminatory treatment to function effectively. The bias was a feature, not a bug, because it helped ensure that certain passengers maintained control over resources they were using to commit crimes. The realization was both disturbing and empowering, as it confirmed that addressing discrimination wasn't just about moral leadership, it was about preventing criminal activities that could destroy the company's reputation and financial stability. As the investigation continued to expand, Malik understood that his acquisition of Skyline Airlines had evolved from a business transaction into a case study of how corporate accountability and civil rights enforcement could work together to create meaningful change. The real test would be whether the changes he was implementing would prevent future discrimination and criminal activities, or whether the culture of privilege and corruption was too deeply embedded to be transformed through leadership and policy changes alone. The trading floor at Platinum Capital looked like a disaster zone by Thursday morning, less than 48 hours after Victoria Ashford's arrest had triggered a cascade of investigations that were destroying everything she had spent years building. The elegant glass offices that had once symbolized financial power and sophistication now felt like a mausoleum for a career that had died in spectacular fashion. Marcus Webb, the firm's managing partner and Victoria's longtime mentor, sat in his corner office watching CNBC's coverage of the scandal while fielding phone calls from investors who were pulling their money as fast as their legal teams could process the paperwork. The firm that his father had built from nothing was hemorrhaging assets at a rate that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. The teacher's retirement fund pulled their $400 million this morning. His assistant reported, her voice barely concealing her panic. The Municipal Workers Union followed with $250 million. We're down 60% of our assets under management since Tuesday. Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of realizing that his protégé's criminal activities had destroyed not just her own career, but the legacy that 3 generations of his family had built in the financial services industry. What about Victoria's accounts? Have we been able to isolate her trading activities from the firm's other business? The federal investigators have frozen everything connected to her activities pending their investigation. We can't access approximately 30% of our operating capital until the criminal case is resolved. The phone rang again, and Marcus could see from the caller ID that it was another major institutional investor requesting an emergency meeting to discuss their relationship with the firm. He had been having these conversations for 2 days straight, and they all followed the same basic pattern expressions of concern about the firm's compliance culture, questions about supervisory oversight, and barely veiled threats to terminate investment relationships unless dramatic changes were made immediately. At the federal detention facility downtown, Victoria was experiencing her own version of collapse as she watched news coverage of her former life disintegrating in real time. The expensive clothes had been replaced with standard-issue jail uniforms, and the platinum hair that had been her signature was pulled back in a style that emphasized how dramatically her circumstances had changed. Her lawyer had been brutally honest about her prospects during their most recent meeting. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The federal government was treating her case as a priority, and her cooperation with investigators was her only hope for avoiding the maximum sentence. The prosecutors are offering 15 years if you plead guilty and provide complete information about everyone involved in the scheme, her attorney had explained. If you go to trial and lose, you're looking at 25 to 30 years. What about appeals? What about arguing that I was just providing investment advice based on publicly available information? Victoria, they have recorded phone calls, financial records, and witness testimony from airline employees who were taking money from you in exchange for insider information. This isn't a gray area case where we can argue about interpretation. This is clear-cut criminal conspiracy. The reality of spending the next 15 to 30 years in federal prison was slowly sinking in, replacing the entitled outrage she had felt during her first few hours in custody with something approaching genuine remorse. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria was forced to confront the possibility that her actions had consequences she couldn't buy or manipulate her way out of. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of her arrest were spreading throughout the airline industry as federal investigators expanded their inquiry to examine whether similar corruption existed at other carriers. The FBI had issued subpoenas to 6 major airlines requesting records of crew assignments, passenger accommodations, and any financial relationships between employees and frequent travelers. Captain Richard Stone and Blair Whitfield were discovering that their termination from Skyline Airlines was just the beginning of their legal problems. Federal investigators had identified them as key figures in Victoria's insider trading scheme, and both were facing potential criminal charges for their roles in facilitating securities fraud. The payments from Ashford's shell company total over $40,000 in the past 18 months, Agent Rodriguez explained to prosecutors as they reviewed the evidence. That's far beyond what anyone could characterize as tips or gratuities for good service. This was payment for specific information and accommodations that enabled criminal activities. Stone's lawyer was trying to negotiate a cooperation agreement that would reduce his client's potential sentence in exchange for testimony against Victoria and information about other passengers who might have been involved in similar schemes. But the evidence against him was substantial enough that prosecutors felt confident about securing convictions even without his cooperation. "My client was a career airline pilot who got involved with the wrong people," Stone's attorney argued during plea negotiations. He didn't understand the sophisticated financial implications of the information he was sharing. Your client was taking money in exchange for non-public information that was used to commit securities fraud, the prosecutor replied. Understanding the sophisticated financial implications isn't required for conspiracy charges. At Skyline Airlines headquarters, Malik was coordinating the company's response to an investigation that had expanded far beyond the original discrimination incident. The FBI had requested access to years of employee records, passenger complaint files, and financial data as they tried to determine how widespread the corruption had been. "We're cooperating fully with all federal investigations," Malik announced during his second press conference in 3 days. "But I want to be clear that the criminal activities we've discovered were not representative of the vast majority of our employees who have served passengers with integrity and professionalism." The stock market had initially reacted negatively to news of the federal investigation, but investor sentiment was beginning to shift as analysts recognized that Malik's decisive response and the company's cooperation with authorities might actually strengthen the airline's long-term prospects. "Skyline Airlines is essentially getting a free reputation cleanup," explained a financial analyst during a CNBC interview. "The new ownership discovered criminal activities that predated their acquisition and is taking immediate steps to address them. That's exactly the kind of corporate governance that institutional investors want to see." The passenger compensation fund that Malik had established was processing claims at a rate that surprised even the lawyers administering it. Hundreds of passengers were coming forward with stories of discriminatory treatment they had experienced on Skyline flights, many describing incidents that followed patterns similar to Malik's experience. The volume of complaints suggests that what happened to Mr. Washington wasn't an isolated incident, reported the civil rights attorney overseeing victim compensation. "We're seeing evidence of systematic bias in how certain passengers were treated, particularly passengers of color who were traveling in premium cabin classes." But the most significant development was the announcement that the Department of Transportation was launching a comprehensive review of discrimination in the airline industry, using the Skyline Airlines case as a catalyst for examining industry-wide practices and policies. This investigation has revealed concerning patterns that may extend beyond a single airline, announced Transportation Secretary Jennifer Martinez during a press briefing. "We're committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or perceived economic status." The announcement sent shockwaves through airline boardrooms across the country as executives realized that their own companies might soon face the kind of scrutiny that had already destroyed careers and exposed criminal activities at Skyline Airlines. For Camila Santos, who had been promoted to senior flight attendant and was helping to develop new anti-discrimination training programs, the rapid changes felt like vindication of everything she had tried to report through official channels. "It's amazing how quickly things can change when people in authority positions actually listen and take action," she told a reporter during an interview about the airline's transformation. "For years, I felt like I was shouting into the wind about problems that everyone could see but no one wanted to address." The training programs that Camilla was helping to design were being watched closely by other airlines as potential models for industry-wide adoption. The combination of bias awareness education, clear reporting procedures, and zero-tolerance enforcement was creating a new standard for how discrimination should be addressed in corporate environments. As Victoria sat in her jail cell watching news coverage of the industry changes that her arrest had triggered, she was forced to confront the magnitude of what her sense of entitlement had cost, not just herself, but everyone connected to her criminal activities. The airline's employees who had taken her money were facing criminal charges. The investment firm where she had worked was collapsing. The industry itself was being forced to examine and change practices that had enabled discrimination for decades. The woman who had insisted that a black passenger should be grateful for the opportunity to move to economy class was now facing the prospect of spending the next 15 to 30 years in a 6-by-8-foot cell, with no privileges, no special treatment, and no ability to buy her way out of the consequences of her actions. Justice, she was learning, had a way of evening the scales in ways that money and privilege couldn't prevent. The small cafe in downtown Chicago, where Elena Rodriguez sat with her laptop, had become her unofficial office for the past week as she worked on what would become the most important article of her journalism career. The story that had begun as a viral video about airline discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive investigation of corporate corruption, criminal conspiracy, and the intersection of privilege and prejudice in American business culture. Elena had been a business reporter for 12 years, covering everything from startup acquisitions to congressional hearings on financial regulation, but she had never witnessed a story that combined so many elements of social and economic significance. The article she was writing would eventually win a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism, but for now she was simply trying to capture the full scope of what she had witnessed and learned. The morning of November 7th began like any other Tuesday for the passengers boarding Skyline Airlines Flight 847 to London. She wrote her fingers moving across the keyboard with the rhythm of someone who had found her professional calling. By afternoon, that routine flight had triggered a federal investigation, exposed a criminal conspiracy, and launched a national conversation about discrimination that would change an entire industry. She paused to review her notes from interviews with passengers, crew members, federal investigators, and corporate executives marveling at how many lives had been affected by a single confrontation over an airplane seat. The ripple effects were still expanding more than a week after Victoria Ashford's arrest, touching everything from individual careers to federal policy. At his temporary office in Skyline Airlines' Chicago headquarters, Malik was reviewing the latest reports on the company's transformation efforts while preparing for another round of interviews with national news organizations. The past week had been a master class in crisis management, corporate leadership, and the complex dynamics of using business success to advance social justice causes. The discrimination complaint hotline we established has received over 800 calls in the past week, reported James Mitchell during their daily briefing. About 60% are from Skyline passengers, but 40% are from passengers who experienced discrimination on other airlines and want to know if we can help them. What's our response to complaints about other airlines? We're referring them to civil rights organizations and providing information about how to file complaints with federal agencies. But several other airlines have reached out about licensing our anti-discrimination training programs for their own use. Malik nodded, understanding that the crisis had created an unexpected business opportunity to export the policy changes and training programs they were developing to competitors who wanted to avoid facing similar scandals. What about the financial impact? Are we seeing any revenue effects from all the media attention? Actually, booking rates are up 15% over the past week. The demographic analysis shows we're attracting passengers who specifically want to fly with an airline that takes discrimination seriously. It's like we've accidentally created a competitive advantage through moral leadership. The irony wasn't lost on Malik that Victoria Ashford's attempt to humiliate him had resulted in enhanced profitability for the company she had inadvertently helped him transform. The viral videos of her racist behavior and subsequent arrest had generated more positive publicity for Skyline Airlines' new direction than any traditional marketing campaign could have achieved. In a federal courtroom downtown, Victoria was appearing before a judge for a preliminary hearing that would determine the conditions of her pretrial detention. The expensive lawyer her family had hired was arguing for house arrest with electronic monitoring, while federal prosecutors insisted that she represented a flight risk, given her access to offshore financial accounts and international travel history. Your Honor, Ms. Ashford has substantial ties to the community, including family members and business relationships that make flight unlikely, her attorney argued. She has also been cooperative with federal investigators and has provided valuable information about the broader conspiracy. Ms. Ashford used her position and resources to commit sophisticated financial crimes over an extended period, the federal prosecutor responded. Her cooperation appears to be motivated by self-interest rather than genuine remorse, and her access to international financial networks makes her a significant flight risk. The judge listened to both arguments before making a decision that would confine Victoria to a federal detention facility until her trial. The woman who had insisted on special treatment and premium accommodations would spend the next several months in a shared cell with limited privileges and no ability to influence her circumstances through wealth or connections. The defendant's criminal activities demonstrate a pattern of using privilege and resources to violate the law while showing disregard for the rights and dignity of others, the judge explained. Pretrial detention is necessary to ensure public safety and the integrity of the judicial process. As Victoria was led back to her cell, she caught a glimpse of news coverage on a television in the courthouse lobby showing Malik Washington being interviewed by 60 Minutes about corporate responsibility and racial justice. The man she had tried to force out of her seat was now being celebrated as a model of principled business leadership while she was facing decades in prison for the crimes that her sense of entitlement had led her to commit. Back at O'Hare Airport, Camila Santos was conducting a training session for new flight attendants on bias recognition and passenger rights protection. The woman who had risked her job to speak up during the original confrontation was now helping to design educational programs that would prevent future discrimination incidents. The most important thing to understand, she told the group of trainees, is that passenger service means treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived economic status. When we start making assumptions about who deserves better treatment, we create the conditions for discrimination and potentially criminal activity. The trainees hung on her every word, understanding that they were learning from someone who had witnessed history being made and had played a crucial role in triggering positive change. Several had specifically requested to work for Skyline Airlines because of the company's new reputation for taking discrimination seriously. What should we do if a passenger makes discriminatory comments about another passenger? Asked one of the trainees. You intervene immediately and professionally. You explain that all passengers deserve respect and that discriminatory language violates our code of conduct. If the behavior continues, you involve supervisors and security as necessary. We never tolerate discrimination even from passengers who think their status gives them special privileges. Meanwhile, Captain Richard Stone and Blair Whitfield were experiencing their own reckonings as they faced the reality that their careers in aviation were over and their legal problems were just beginning. Both had been interviewed by federal investigators multiple times as prosecutors built cases for conspiracy and fraud charges. Stone's 22 years of flying experience meant nothing in the face of evidence that he had been taking money in exchange for providing non-public information to passengers who used it to commit securities fraud. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked, and his pension benefits were frozen pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. I never thought of myself as a criminal, he told his wife during one of their increasingly rare conversations. I thought I was just providing good customer service to passengers who appreciated extra attention. You were taking money, Richard. Cash payments from passengers in exchange for special treatment and information. How did you think that was going to end? Blair was facing similar reckonings as she contemplated a future that included potential prison time and the permanent loss of the career that had defined her identity for 15 years. The woman who had prided herself on providing superior service to valued customers was learning that discrimination disguised as customer service was still discrimination with legal consequences that could destroy everything she had worked to build. The union representatives who were advising both former employees had been frank about their prospects. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Their actions were clearly documented in passenger videos and financial records, and their best hope was cooperation agreements that might reduce their sentences in exchange for testimony against Victoria and information about other potential criminal activities. As the week concluded, Malik found himself reflecting on how quickly institutional change could occur when leadership was committed to transformation rather than protection of the status quo. The airline that had discriminated against him was now becoming a model for corporate accountability and social responsibility, proving that crisis could be converted into opportunity when handled with integrity and purpose. The seat that had started the entire confrontation, 1A on Flight 847, had been officially designated as a memorial to passenger dignity, with a small plaque that read, "Reserved for the principle that all travelers deserve respect." It served as a daily reminder to crew members and passengers that equality wasn't just a legal requirement but a fundamental value that defined the company's mission. For Victoria, sitting in her federal holding cell and watching news coverage of the industry, changes her actions had triggered. The personal reckoning was perhaps the most profound of all. The woman who had believed that her wealth and status gave her the right to treat others as obstacles was learning that true justice had a way of humbling even those who thought themselves above consequences. The bill for her sense of entitlement was finally coming due, and for the first time in her privileged life, she couldn't afford to pay it. The congressional hearing room was packed with reporters, industry executives, and civil rights advocates, as Malik Washington prepared to deliver testimony that would influence federal transportation policy for years to come. The House Subcommittee on Aviation had called the hearing to examine discrimination in air travel, using the Skyline Airlines case as a catalyst for broader legislative action. 6 months had passed since the confrontation on Flight 847, and the transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. Skyline Airlines had become the most profitable major carrier in the United States, proving that principled business practices and social responsibility were not just compatible with financial success, they were drivers of it. "Mr. Washington, thank you for joining us today," said Congresswoman Patricia Morrison, the subcommittee chair. "Your company's response to the discrimination incident has been widely praised as a model for corporate accountability. Can you tell us what you've learned about the prevalence of discrimination in air travel?" Malik adjusted the microphone and looked out at the packed hearing room, recognizing faces of passengers from Flight 847, federal investigators who had worked on Victoria's case, and airline executives who were nervously awaiting his testimony. "Congresswoman Morrison, what we discovered through our internal investigation and our cooperation with federal authorities is that discrimination in air travel is more widespread and more systematically enabled than most people realize. It's often disguised as customer service decisions or operational requirements, which makes it difficult to identify and address through traditional complaint processes. What specific changes has Skyline Airlines implemented to address these issues? We've established a zero-tolerance policy that has resulted in the termination of 43 employees for discriminatory behavior. We've implemented comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff. We've created anonymous reporting systems that have processed over 1,500 reports of inappropriate behavior. And we've paid over $12 million in compensation to passengers who experienced discrimination on our flights. The numbers were staggering, representing the largest passenger compensation program in airline industry history and providing concrete evidence of how pervasive discriminatory practices had been before the company's transformation. Have these changes affected your company's profitability? Our revenue is up 37% compared to the same period last year, and our customer satisfaction ratings are the highest in the industry. Treating passengers with dignity and respect isn't just morally right, it's good business. In the audience, Elena Rodriguez was taking notes for a follow-up article about the long-term impacts of the discrimination incident that had launched her Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation. The story had continued to evolve and expand, touching on corporate governance, federal regulation, and the role of social media in exposing institutional bias. Also in attendance was Camila Santos, who had been promoted to Director of Passenger Services and was now responsible for implementing anti-discrimination policies across the entire Skyline Airlines system. Her transformation from powerless flight attendant to influential corporate executive had become a symbol of how organizational change could create opportunities for previously marginalized voices. Mr. Washington, what would you say to critics who argue that your response was motivated more by public relations considerations than genuine commitment to civil rights? Asked Congressman Robert Hayes, one of the few committee members who seemed skeptical of Malik's testimony. Congressman Hayes, I would invite those critics to examine our actions rather than speculate about our motivations. We've implemented changes that have cost us millions of dollars in the short term and required us to terminate employees with years of experience. We've cooperated with federal investigations that have exposed criminal activities that we could have tried to minimize or hide. These aren't public relations gestures, they're fundamental changes to how our company operates. The hearing was being broadcast live on C-SPAN and covered by major news networks, ensuring that Malik's testimony would reach audiences far beyond the congressional committee. His words were being parsed by airline industry executives, civil rights organizations, and federal regulators who were using the Skyline case to develop new policies and enforcement mechanisms. Meanwhile, at the Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania, where Victoria Ashford was serving her 15-year sentence for securities fraud and conspiracy, the fallen hedge fund executive was watching the congressional hearing on a small television in the facility's common room. The woman who had demanded special treatment was now wearing standard-issue prison uniforms and following institutional schedules that left no room for personal preferences. Her cooperation with federal investigators had resulted in a reduced sentence, but 15 years in federal prison was still a devastating consequence for someone who had expected to spend her middle age managing billions in investment assets and enjoying the privileges that wealth provided. The insider trading scheme that had seemed so sophisticated when she was profiting from it now looked like the criminal conspiracy it had always been. The criminal case against Victoria Ashford and her co-conspirators has resulted in $47 million in recovered assets and criminal penalties, reported Agent Maria Rodriguez during her own testimony to the congressional subcommittee. The investigation has also led to charges against 16 other individuals, including airline employees, hedge fund managers, and corporate executives who were involved in similar schemes. The scope of the criminal conspiracy that had been uncovered through Victoria's arrest was still expanding 6 months later, with federal investigators discovering similar arrangements at 3 other major airlines and multiple investment firms. The case had become a model for how corporate corruption and civil rights violations often intersected in ways that enabled both types of criminal activity. Back at Skyline Airlines headquarters, James Mitchell was coordinating the company's response to licensing requests from competitors who wanted to implement similar anti-discrimination programs. What had begun as a crisis management response had evolved into a revenue-generating business opportunity as other airlines paid for access to Skyline's training materials and policy frameworks. We've received requests from 38 airlines, including 6 international carriers, James reported during his weekly meeting with Malik. The licensing fees alone will generate approximately $15 million in additional revenue this year. What about employee retention and recruitment? Are we seeing any impacts from our policy changes? Applications for crew positions are up over 200%, and our employee satisfaction ratings are the highest in company history. We're attracting talent from competitors who want to work for an organization with clear values and principled leadership. The transformation had extended beyond Skyline Airlines to influence industry-wide changes as competitors rushed to implement their own anti-discrimination initiatives rather than risk facing similar scandals. The Department of Transportation had announced new federal regulations requiring airlines to establish bias training programs and anonymous reporting systems, essentially making Skyline's voluntary changes mandatory throughout the industry. Captain Richard Stone and Blair Whitfield had both pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and were serving prison sentences of 3 and 2 years, respectively. Their cooperation with federal investigators had helped prosecutors build cases against other airline employees who had been involved in similar corruption schemes, but their own careers in aviation were permanently over. The union that had represented them during the criminal proceedings had used their cases as cautionary examples in training programs about the legal and professional consequences of discriminatory behavior. The message was clear. Bias and corruption weren't just moral failures, they were career-ending mistakes that could result in criminal prosecution and imprisonment. For the passengers who had witnessed the original confrontation on Flight 847, the 6-month anniversary had become a time for reflection on how ordinary people could play crucial roles in exposing injustice and creating positive change. Several had testified at congressional hearings, participated in documentary films, and spoken at conferences about the importance of witnessing and recording discriminatory behavior. David Chen, the businessman who had spoken up during the original incident, had established a foundation that provided legal support for discrimination victims and funded research into bias in transportation services. His organization had processed over 300 cases and had achieved settlements totaling more than $8 million for victims of airline discrimination. Sarah Johnson, the teacher who had witnessed Victoria's meltdown, had incorporated the incident into her curriculum as a case study of how privilege and prejudice intersected to enable both discrimination and criminal activity. Her students used the Skyline case to examine contemporary civil rights issues and the role of corporate accountability in addressing institutional bias. As Malik concluded his congressional testimony and prepared to leave the hearing room, he reflected on how dramatically his life and business had changed since that Tuesday morning when he had simply wanted to fly to London for a business meeting. The acquisition of Skyline Airlines had been intended as a routine corporate transaction, but it had evolved into something much more significant, a demonstration of how business leaders could use their resources and influence to advance social justice causes. The seat that had started the entire confrontation, 1A on Flight 847, was still flying regularly between Chicago and London, but it now carried a different meaning for crew members and passengers who understood its symbolic importance. It represented the principle that respect and dignity weren't luxuries to be purchased, but fundamental rights that belonged to every human being regardless of their race, appearance, or perceived economic status. The woman who had demanded that seat because of her sense of entitlement was now serving a federal prison sentence that would keep her confined for most of the next decade. The man she had tried to humiliate was using his wealth and influence to create changes that would benefit millions of travelers for years to come. Justice Malik had learned wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about preventing future harm by creating systems and cultures that valued human dignity above personal privilege. The documentary premiere at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., had attracted an audience that read like a who's who of civil rights leaders, business executives, and government officials. Seat 1. A journey from discrimination to justice had been 18 months in the making, following the aftermath of the Skyline Airlines incident and its impact on American corporate culture and federal policy. Malik Washington sat in the front row next to his parents, who had flown in from Detroit for the screening. His father, a retired construction worker whose calloused hands had built the foundation for his son's success, squeezed Malik's shoulder as the lights dimmed and the film began. "I'm proud of you, son," his father whispered, "not because of the money you made or the companies you bought, but because of how you used your success to help other people." The documentary opened with the passenger videos that had first brought the incident to national attention, but quickly evolved into a broader examination of how individual courage and corporate accountability could create lasting social change. Director Ava Chen had spent months interviewing everyone involved in the story, from passengers and crew members to federal investigators and policy experts. The film didn't shy away from the ugliness of the original confrontation, showing Victoria Ashford's racist behavior and the crew's complicity in full detail. But it also focused on the transformation that had followed, documenting how crisis could become opportunity when leadership was committed to fundamental change rather than damage control. The morning of November 7th looked like any other Tuesday. Elena Rodriguez's voice narrated over footage of O'Hare Airport. But by afternoon, a routine flight had become a catalyst for examining privilege, prejudice, and power in American business culture. In the audience, Camila Santos watched her younger self on the big screen, remembering the fear she had felt when contradicting her supervisors during the original incident. The woman on screen looked uncertain and nervous, a sharp contrast to the confident executive she had become as Skyline Airlines Director of Passenger Services. "I was terrified of losing my job," her voice said in an interview segment. "But I was more terrified of staying silent while watching another person be treated as less than human because of the color of their skin." The documentary showed how Camilla's courage to speak up had not only helped expose the discrimination, but had also launched her own transformation from powerless employee to influential corporate leader. Her story had become a powerful example of how organizational change could create opportunities for previously marginalized voices to achieve positions of authority and influence. Victoria Ashford appeared in the film through archival footage and recorded phone calls from federal prison where she was serving her 15-year sentence. The woman who had once embodied entitled privilege now spoke from an institutional setting that stripped away every symbol of status and wealth that had once defined her identity. "I believed my money and my family background made me better than other people," Victoria said during a recorded interview from prison. "I thought I deserved special treatment because of who I was, not because of how I treated others. It took federal prison to teach me that human dignity isn't something you can buy or inherit. It's something you earn through how you respect other people." The interviews with Victoria were among the most powerful segments of the documentary, showing a woman who had been forced to confront the consequences of her beliefs and behaviors. Her cooperation with federal investigators had helped expose a broader network of corruption, but it had also required her to acknowledge the role that racism and entitlement had played in enabling criminal activities. The discrimination wasn't separate from the fraud, she explained during one interview. They were connected because both were based on the belief that some people mattered more than others and that rules didn't apply to people like me. The film also examined the broader impacts of the incident on the airline industry and federal policy. Transportation. Secretary Jennifer Martinez appeared on screen to discuss the regulatory changes that had been implemented as a result of the Skyline case, including mandatory bias training for airline employees and enhanced enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. This case demonstrated that discrimination in transportation services wasn't just a civil rights issue. It was also a criminal justice issue, Secretary Martinez explained. When bias becomes institutionalized and systematic, it creates conditions that enable other forms of criminal activity. The documentary showed how the Department of Transportation's new regulations had been applied industry-wide, forcing airlines to implement anti-discrimination policies and training programs that had been pioneered at Skyline Airlines. The changes had affected millions of passengers and thousands of airline employees, creating new standards for how air travel discrimination would be prevented and addressed. Agent Maria Rodriguez appeared in the film to discuss the ongoing federal investigation that had grown out of Victoria's arrest. The case had ultimately resulted in criminal charges against 47 individuals and had recovered over $200 million in criminal proceeds and civil penalties. The Ashford case showed us that financial crimes and civil rights violations often intersect in ways that amplify the damage to both individuals and institutions, Agent Rodriguez explained. When people use their privilege to commit crimes, they're not just stealing money, they're undermining the fundamental principle that everyone deserves equal treatment under the law. As the documentary continued, it showed how the individual transformations had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the original incident. David Chen's foundation had provided legal support for hundreds of discrimination victims. Sarah Johnson's educational programs had reached thousands of students. Elena Rodriguez's journalism had inspired other reporters to investigate discrimination in transportation and hospitality services. The film's climax focused on Malik's congressional testimony and the passage of federal legislation that established new protections for travelers and enhanced penalties for transportation discrimination. The bill known as the Passenger Dignity Act had been signed into law by the president in a ceremony that included several passengers from Flight 847. Sometimes, individual moments of courage can create momentum for institutional change, Malik said during his interview for the documentary. What happened on that flight wasn't just about me or Victoria, or even Skyline Airlines. It was about whether we as a society would accept discrimination as normal or demand something better. The documentary concluded with recent footage of Flight 847 making its regular route between Chicago and London, now staffed by a diverse crew trained in the anti-discrimination policies that had become industry standard. Seat 1. A still carried its memorial plaque dedicating it to passenger dignity. But the real memorial was the changed culture that had grown out of the original confrontation. As the credits rolled and the audience erupted in applause, Malik felt the weight of understanding how individual actions could create lasting change when supported by institutional commitment and public accountability. The discrimination he had experienced had been wrong, but the response to it had proven that American business culture could evolve and improve when leaders were willing to prioritize principles over profits. After the screening, Malik was approached by a young black woman who introduced herself as a recent business school graduate starting her career in corporate consulting. "Mr. Washington, I wanted to thank you for showing that success and principles don't have to be mutually exclusive," she said. "Your example has inspired me to look for ways to use business as a force for positive change." Similar conversations continued throughout the reception as young professionals, civil rights advocates, and business leaders discussed how the Skyline case had influenced their own work and perspectives. The story had become more than just a viral video about airline discrimination. It had become a case study of how individual courage and corporate accountability could work together to create meaningful social progress. As Malik prepared to leave the Kennedy Center, he received a text message from Camila Santos, who was in Chicago preparing for another training session with new Skyline employees. The message included a photo of the latest group of flight attendants completing their anti-discrimination certification, with a caption that read, "Your courage created opportunities for all of us to be better." The healing process that had begun with a confrontation over an airplane seat had evolved into something much larger. A demonstration that change was possible when people were willing to stand up for principles and institutions were willing to transform themselves rather than simply defend the status quo. For the first time in months, Malik felt genuinely optimistic about the future of American business culture and its capacity to serve all people with dignity and respect. The seat that had started everything was still flying, but it now carried passengers who could travel with confidence that their rights would be protected and their humanity would be respected. The woman who had demanded that seat was spending her nights in federal prison, while the man she had tried to humiliate was using his influence to ensure that no other passenger would face the discrimination he had experienced. Justice had taken time to arrive, but when it came, it had brought transformation that would benefit countless people for generations to come. 2 years to the day after the confrontation that had changed everything, Malik Washington found himself back in Seat 1A on Flight 847, making the same Chicago to London route that had launched a national conversation about discrimination, privilege, and corporate accountability. But everything about the experience was different now, from the crew training that emphasized dignity and respect to the passenger compensation policies that had become industry standard. Camila Santos, now the airline's Director of Passenger Services, personally greeted Malik as he boarded the aircraft. Her transformation from fearful flight attendant to confident executive had been one of the most inspiring outcomes of the company's cultural revolution, proving that organizational change could create opportunities for previously marginalized voices to achieve positions of influence and authority. "Mr. Washington, welcome back to Flight 847, Camila said, with the genuine smile of someone who had found purpose in her work. "I think you'll be pleased with some of the passengers traveling with us today." As Malik settled into the seat that had once been the center of a viral confrontation, he noticed a young black boy, perhaps 8 years old, sitting across the aisle with his grandmother. The child was wearing a school uniform and clutching what appeared to be a science fair certificate, his eyes wide with excitement about his first international flight. "That's Marcus Williams," Camilla explained quietly. "He won the National Elementary Science Competition, and his prize is a trip to visit the European Space Agency headquarters in London. His grandmother saved for 2 years to afford the first-class upgrade because she wanted him to experience the best treatment possible on his Victory flight." Malik felt a surge of emotion as he watched the young boy explore the first-class cabin with wonder, touching the leather seats and marveling at the technology built into each passenger station. The child's presence in that space represented everything that the transformation of Skyline Airlines had been designed to achieve: a world where dignity and respect weren't luxuries to be purchased, but fundamental rights that belonged to every passenger. During the flight, Malik had the opportunity to speak with Marcus about his science project, which focused on developing more efficient solar panel designs for use in developing countries. The boy's enthusiasm and intelligence reminded Malik of his own childhood dreams and the obstacles that could either inspire achievement or create barriers to success. "My teacher said that engineers who look like me are rare in aerospace companies," Marcus told Malik as they discussed his career aspirations. "But she also said that rare doesn't mean impossible." "Your teacher is right about both things," Malik replied. "But I think you'll find that rare is becoming less rare every day, especially for young people who are willing to work hard and refuse to accept limitations that other people try to impose on them." The conversation continued throughout the 8-hour flight, with Malik sharing stories about his own path from Detroit teenager to tech billionaire, emphasizing the importance of education, persistence, and maintaining dignity in the face of discrimination. By the time they landed at Heathrow, Marcus had a new perspective on what was possible for his future and a business card from one of America's most successful entrepreneurs. "Mr. Washington," Marcus said as they prepared to deplane, "when I become a famous engineer, I'm going to fly first class on every trip. And remember that it's not about the seat, it's about having the courage to take up space where you belong." The wisdom in the 8-year-old's words struck Malik as a perfect summary of everything the past 2 years had taught him about power privilege and the responsibility that came with success. The seat wasn't important because it was luxurious or expensive. It was important because it represented the principle that every human being deserved respect regardless of their race, age, or perceived status. As Malik made his way through Heathrow Airport, he reflected on how dramatically the airline industry had changed since that November morning when Victoria Ashford had demanded that he give up his seat. The Passenger Dignity Act had been implemented across all major carriers, creating federal standards for anti-discrimination training and enforcement. The financial penalties for discriminatory behavior had become severe enough to ensure that airline executives took prevention seriously as both a moral obligation and a business necessity. Victoria herself had become an unexpected advocate for reform during her federal prison sentence, working with civil rights organizations to educate business leaders about the connections between privilege, prejudice, and criminal activity. Her cooperation with ongoing investigations had helped prosecute dozens of other white-collar criminals who had used discriminatory practices to facilitate financial fraud. "I spend my days in federal prison thinking about the 8 minutes that destroyed my life," Victoria had written in a letter that was later published in Harvard Business Review. 8 minutes when I decided that my comfort was more important than another person's dignity. I can't change what I did, but I can help other people understand how entitlement and bias create conditions for much worse behavior. Her transformation from entitled executive to prison reform advocate had been genuine, if motivated partly by the reality that cooperation with authorities was her only hope for a reduced sentence. But the impact of her advocacy had been significant, particularly in reaching business audiences who might dismiss discrimination as a purely moral issue, but paid attention when it was framed as a criminal liability risk. The broader cultural changes had extended far beyond aviation. Hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and entertainment venues had all implemented new policies and training programs designed to prevent discriminatory treatment of customers based on race appearance or perceived economic status. The viral nature of the original Skyline Airlines videos had created awareness that discriminatory behavior would be recorded shared and could result in devastating consequences for both individuals and organizations. But for Malik, the most meaningful changes had been personal. His relationship with his parents had deepened as they worked together on educational initiatives that provided scholarships and mentorship opportunities for underrepresented students in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. The foundation they had established was funding programs in 12 cities, reaching thousands of young people who might otherwise lack access to advanced educational opportunities. His business success had also evolved beyond simple profit maximization to include explicit commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion that were measured and reported as seriously as financial performance. Nexus Dynamics had become a model for how technology companies could advance social justice causes while maintaining competitive advantages in rapidly changing markets. As Malik's car pulled away from Heathrow Airport toward central London, he received a text message from Elena Rodriguez, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the Skyline Airlines case had launched her career as one of America's most respected investigative journalists. She was working on a follow-up story about the long-term impacts of corporate accountability movements on American business culture. 2 years later, what would you say to someone who argues that discrimination in air travel was just a minor issue that received disproportionate attention? Elena's text asked. Malik typed his response as London traffic moved slowly through the late afternoon. I would say that there are no minor issues when it comes to human dignity. Every act of discrimination, no matter how small it seems, contributes to a culture that enables larger acts of injustice. What happened on Flight 847 wasn't important because of the specific seat or the specific flight. It was important because it represented the choice between accepting bias as normal or demanding something better. The message captured what had become Malik's core philosophy about the relationship between individual actions and social change. Single moments of courage or cowardice could create momentum for broader transformation, but only when they were supported by institutional commitment to principles over convenience. As his London meetings concluded later that week, Malik made one final stop before returning to Chicago. He visited the offices of Amnesty International UK, where he was funding a new program to document and address discrimination in transportation services worldwide. The initiative would provide legal support for victims, training for transportation workers, and research into the global patterns of bias that affected millions of travelers every year. The Skyline Airlines case showed us that discrimination isn't just an American problem or just an aviation problem, explained Dr. Sarah Mahmood, the human rights lawyer directing the program. It's a human problem that requires coordinated international responses to create lasting change. The program represented Malik's commitment to ensuring that the lessons learned from his own experience would benefit people far beyond the United States airline industry. The seat that had started everything had become a symbol of universal human dignity that transcended national borders, corporate cultures, and industry practices. On his return flight to Chicago, Malik once again occupied Seat 1A, but this time he shared the first-class cabin with a diverse group of passengers that included business travelers, families, students, and elderly couples. The crew treated everyone with identical courtesy and professionalism, creating an environment where passenger dignity was the default expectation rather than an exception to be negotiated. As the plane lifted off from Heathrow and climbed above the London clouds toward the Atlantic, Malik looked out the window at the city lights disappearing below and reflected on how far he had traveled, not just geographically, but in terms of understanding his own responsibilities as a business leader and social advocate. The woman who had tried to force him out of this seat was spending her evening in federal prison, where she would remain for many more years. The airline employees who had threatened him with arrest had found new careers outside the aviation industry. The corrupt business relationships that had enabled securities fraud had been exposed and dismantled. But more importantly, millions of passengers would travel with greater confidence that their rights would be protected and their humanity would be respected. Thousands of airline employees had received training that would help them recognize and prevent discriminatory behavior. Hundreds of discrimination victims had received compensation and justice through new legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms. The seat beneath him was still leather and metal, still positioned at the front of the aircraft, still expensive and exclusive. But it now carried a different meaning, not as a symbol of privilege to be defended, but as a reminder that respect and dignity belonged to everyone who had the courage to claim their rightful place in the world. As Flight 847 cruised toward Chicago at 37,000 feet, Malik closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with the knowledge that his success was being used to serve purposes larger than personal achievement. Sometimes the most important battles were indeed fought in the sky, and sometimes the most significant victories were measured not in dollars or market share, but in the simple recognition that every human being deserved to travel through the world with dignity intact. The journey from discrimination to justice had come full circle, but the destination was really just the beginning of a longer trip toward the kind of society where moments like the original confrontation would become impossible because respect for human dignity was no longer negotiable. Victoria served her complete sentence and now works as a diversity consultant, using her story as a cautionary tale about privilege and prejudice. Captain Stone never flew again, but found purpose teaching ethics courses at a community college. Blair Whitfield retrained as a social worker, dedicating her life to helping others after learning the cost of discrimination. Skyline Airlines became the gold standard for inclusive travel, inspiring industry-wide changes that protected millions of passengers. The viral video sparked congressional hearings that led to federal anti-discrimination laws in transportation. Camilla eventually became CEO of a major airline herself, carrying forward the dignity-first philosophy that had transformed her own life. The empty seat won. A now bears a small plaque reserved for human dignity. It serves as a daily reminder that respect isn't earned through wealth or status. It's owed to every person who walks through those cabin doors. As Malik often says, we don't just transport passengers. We carry dreams, and every dream deserves the same care. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us continue bringing you stories of justice and transformation. Share your thoughts in the comments about how standing up for what's right has changed your own perspective. Together we can build a world where dignity isn't negotiable, and respect is the standard, not the exception.